So how many people know the term user-managed access? Okay, decent sized crowd. So there's a group of people working on a standard related to OAuth called user-managed access. Eve Naylor has driven this. Are any of the people who are involved with it still here? Or two earlier in the week? Okay, yep, even John's involved. So originally this was going to be a session that was going to be done by another co-editor of UMA, a person named Mache, who is actually an intern at Google this summer. Unfortunately, his father passed away unexpectedly about a week ago. So what I thought I would do is actually give you all show the demos that he's been building and talk about why he came to Google and why we thought it was interesting to take some of his UMA background to a particular use case that we were dealing with. So the particular project that he's been working on is one that we've started calling Street Identity with a group of people involved. And that at a high level, the idea is to separate the concept of an attribute provider who has information about a user and an identity provider whose job might be more a matter of getting user consent to pass this information around. And we brought him in where we had specific goals on the use case and the demos we wanted to achieve, and we didn't care as much about the technology. So we asked him to do an initial technical analysis and then to actually look at some of the existing technology options in the field today, like UMA, JWT, OpenID Connect, et cetera, and report back. He had hoped to do some of that this week, but obviously missed that. Fortunately, yesterday we had some really good sessions on some of the technical details of this, and Mike wrote up some good notes, and hopefully those will be circulated after the summit. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you all just some background on the use case of Street Identity, why it's called that, what we were trying to achieve. Then I'm going to show you all the live demos. They're actually available on the internet if you all want to try them out yourself, and then turn over to an open discussion. So the slide decks I'm going to show you here come from, I think, about March of last year. So we call this the Element OP deck, for those of you all who have seen it. So the idea was to try to connect a user's offline and online identity. And we talked about there being a couple of different layers and how this might happen. That, in general today, most websites, if you go and log into them, well, you log in with passwords. So that's sort of the P part. Trying to get them to move towards, OpenID as relying parties, so that's the O part. Our next problem, though, is great. Well, a website knows my email address and maybe my friends. That doesn't really connect to my, now we can debate the term real-world identity, but at least it doesn't connect to my, for example, verified street address. So we've been looking at how to bridge that gap. And one way we've looked at doing it is by taking advantage of phone numbers as a stronger indication of identity. And then the last piece was trying to figure out, okay, what role should governments play and not play in this space? So I'm going to go through each of those layers in turn and sort of talk about the street identity concept. So under this model, the general idea is most websites where you go to log in, we'd like them to get out of the password management business. You should just go there, click your identity provider, consent to what information you shared, their part is done. And so the idea is let's outsource authentication and user consent to specialist identity providers. That's great in theory. The OpenID community certainly as a whole pursued that for a long time, that user choice concept. But there are some things that OpenID doesn't even attempt to specify. One is OpenID as a protocol doesn't attempt to specify how a user is authenticated. And the second one is specifically at a low level, the protocol maps to these URLs, especially at the beginning. Certainly not much of anything anyone would qualify as a in-person identifier. So that's sort of as far as OpenID got us. Now, interestingly, if you look at a lot of the large identity providers today, like Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, et cetera, one of the things that you may even as end users have noticed is that all of us are individually promoting the idea of users associating a phone number with their account. Now, to be honest, as we started experimenting with that at Google, we found most people would ask for their phone number like, great, what evil thing is Google going to do with my phone number, those horrible, horrible people? The reality is that the main reason we're doing this is because of account takeovers. Someone hijacks your account and it has all the photos from the last 10 years of your life, and all we know is your email address and password, and your password got stolen. You ain't getting your photos back. You're in pretty sad shape. Whereas if we can get your phone number from you at any point, then if your account does get hijacked, then at least we have this phone number as a backup way to verify your identity. We can call it, we can send a one-time code to it, et cetera. So we, Facebook, others have all started going down this route of trying to get users to associate a phone number for these high-value accounts. So it's sort of interesting that we, as providers, we started with email, sort of the lightweight one, but now we're trying to already move towards more of an in-person identifier.
Aaron, could you quickly elaborate about the one-time password of phishable?
Sure. So I'll skip that, but the bullet's there. It's standard slide. So how many people are Gmail users in the room? All right. And now now put all your hands down. Now how many of you are opted into Gmail's two-factor authentication? And you guys are supposed to be the geeky security identity crowd. So do that one commonly. Usually there's no one who raises their hand again, and most people are like, what the heck is that? So for those who don't know, it is possible as a Gmail user to specifically opt in to saying, hey Google, whenever I try to log into my account, if it's a computer I've never used before, I want to be asked for both my password and I want a one-time code sent to me via SMS or phone call to me, or enter it off a mobile application that generates these. This is a technique that we promote to users to protect themselves against account hijacking. However, we're not the first one who have deployed these types of OTP techniques. And we find it's one of these situations where you can outrun the other people. So there's the old joke, two guys are in a forest, they're up in a tree, they see a bear coming along, and one of the guys pauses to put on his sneakers, and the other guy's like, my God, what are you doing? Why are you trying to put on your sneakers? The guy's like, well, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. So one-time passwords sort of fit in this category that as long as only a sort of segment of people are using them, fine, they offer you some protection, but unfortunately the hackers are pretty darn good at phishing people for not just passwords, but also phishing them for these one-time passwords if the market is large enough and economically worth it. So it is a reasonable protection against some attacks. It's not a full protection against phishing. It's sort of one of the elements. But I'd say the more important thing to note of is that while there are techniques like using OTPs and mobile phone numbers for stronger authentication, none of the big identity providers has gotten much adoption of them, unfortunately, yet. Which actually takes us to the next one, which is, okay, well, in lots of conferences like these, Telco 2.0 conferences, one of the discussions has been, okay, why can't we do a better job of getting users to use multi-factor authentication? How can we improve the usability of OTPs or something else of this format? One of the common things that people bring up as an analogy is enterprise BlackBerry devices. So I don't know how many of y'all have experience with these, but generally if you as an employee of a company are issued a BlackBerry device, you turn it on, you put the battery in, you turn on and you see your email. You're not even asked for who you are, you're not asked for your email, you're not asked for your password. The device has been pre-bound to your account, and the device authenticates to your email service using information on the phone, like a SIM or some other unique identifier on the phone. So one of the questions is, how can we achieve that same functionality for a consumer? So a consumer, they just turn on their iPhone and boom, there's their mail. They turn on their Android phone or Windows phone and boom, there's their mail. And if they go to log into a relying party, they just click their identity provider, click consent, and boom, they're done. At that point, we actually get people out of the password business. People don't have to actually enter OTPs. All great in theory, and as technologies have sit around in the world said, yeah, we know how to do that. We've been doing that with BlackBerries and other devices for a while. I pretty much on a monthly basis get someone who calls me up and says, oh, I know how to solve that two-factor auth problem, and they tell me this. However, the mobile operators have asked a very reasonable question for the last 2 years, which is, yes, we as mobile operators know how to do this. What's in it for us? In particular, where's the money? Is the thing I frequently get asked about. So, and we're going to sort of come back to that in a minute to talk about one last hole and then sort of give an answer to that money question. The next question that comes on is, okay, so this gets us, all the way to the role of email providers, mobile operators. The next question came about local governments. So how many people have heard of the term NSTIC, National Strategy for Trust Identity in Cyberspace? Okay, decent sized crowd. So a lot of different governments around the world are trying to figure out, should they be in the business of providing online identity proofing services for their citizens? The US government in particular has made the decision that no, they're not going to get in that business. They would rather commercial entities get in that. And they've been trying to figure out what role they should play or they shouldn't play in this space. But generally what they've said is, they're going to be doing in-person proofing, physical IDs, driver's license, passports, et cetera, but not doing, the electronic part.
I don't understand the comment, Eric. I mean, what's stopping any company to ask for a government issue ID and be satisfied with that?
Well, and that's what I said. They're going to continue to do the physical. They just don't want to do the electronic version of it.
Okay, physical. All right.
Yeah. Sorry, so they're going to continue to do, states will do driver's license, federal will do passports, and et cetera, but they don't want to have an online equivalent of that, at least within the United States. However, to your point, I'll come to clear and say, imagine for a second you lose your mobile phone. Well, how do you replace your mobile phone? Usually you walk into the local AT&T Verizon store, you show your driver's license or passport, and in many cases that's enough to have your phone new phone reissued to you. Clear?
I would say there's a caveat to that, and that is with HSP 12.
But not for citizens.
Right, but for contractors and U.S. government workers, they have CAT cards, which are strong auths with two-factor authentication, and one of the questions coming out of NSTIC is how do those get used potentially in the private sector as valid credentials?
Correct.
So,
yeah, I've been trying to focus a bit more on the consumer citizen certification, but absolutely the case, right? So there's these different layers that sort of almost get us to the point of strong authentication with good usability. But again, we have these known limitations. OpenID, great, we can get rid of passwords, but it's just a mapping to a online identity, not a real world identity. There's this known economic incentive for mobile operators to get involved with improving the usability of strong authentication. And then the third limitation is the government has said, well, we're only willing to go this far in the ID proofing space and no farther. So it left these three gaps. So now we'll sort of introduce the concept of street identity. First start by talking about the low-tech version of it, and then we're going to start demoing the high-tech version. So the low-tech version of this is, and you can sort of read through the example here today, there are many businesses who traditionally have only interacted with their customers in person, but have started to try to engage with them online. So banks, healthcare institutions, utilities. One of the most common ones is, when you get a utility bill and they say, oh, go green, opt in to stop, receiving these, letters in the mail. Of course, they just want to save the cost of a stamp. But at the end of the day, a lot of these businesses have a problem of, say, for example, it's a healthcare institution. If you want to access your healthcare records, online, and you go to their website, how do they know who you are? Theoretically, you would like to go in there, prove that you are Eric Sachs in Redwood City, California. They look up your medical records, they would give them to you. However, the traditional model that's used instead is you go online, you enter in your asserted street address, and they send a postcard to your house with a one-time code. This is sort of the offline equivalent of the email verification when you get a message sent to your inbox, with the one-time link. But many different, businesses, health, banks, Social Security Administration, et cetera, use this technique to link your online identity with your offline identity by just sending a postcard to your house, hoping that you'll get it in a few days, hoping you'll take the time to come back, re-enter this code. Unfortunately, that's a very time-intensive process. It's costly. Not a lot of people finish it. So what if we did a little bit better than this? What if that, and there are a couple of different variants of this, but we'll take sort of the combo version. What if a mobile operator gets in the business of performing two roles for the user? They act as the user's attribute provider, sort of asserting the user's street address. They already have a billing relationship with the person, or they've seen their driver's license, and they actually help them do multi-factor authentication. So you assume that for a moment. Now, in turn, if the user bounds that sort of attribute provider to their identity provider, they could, in turn, go to this, Social Security Administration website or healthcare website, log in, and on one of these standard consent pages where they consent to share their email address or share their photo, they might also choose to share their street address and share how they were authenticated on that device.
Eric,
yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit about, you've been talking about, why do you focus on mobile? I mean, if you're looking for street address, why don't utilities, banks, cable providers, and the likes?
Right. Two reasons. One is because the mobile operators have an additional value proposition they can bring with improving user authentication that the banks and anybody else can't. Right? So it's a particular advantage that they have. The second one is that they actually have the potential over time to do a better job of even more advanced identity proofing, such as in-person proofing, that just because of quantity of stores they have and actually having people come in person. Banks are able to do that as well, but honestly not to the same extent, and certainly can't help with strong authentication. So they're not the only possible attribute provider, they're just the example we used in this use case. Does that make sense?
Have you actually consulted with the banks? Is there ATM
We-
technologies and so on?
Yeah, we've talked about 4 of the banks. Todd Edenskeep, who used to be at Bank of America, was certainly one of the ones who's most vocal in this space. And a good portion of that is they've tried to be sort of combined identity providers, attribute providers themselves in the past. Didn't work that well. The second thing is that they still want to know the question of what's in it for them, in terms of money from this perspective. Websites and that's. Now let me go to the last piece to talk about what's in it to them, which is, okay, so imagine a user, you go to Stanford, you click, your identity providers button, you agree to share some information with that website. Great, Stanford gets your verified address, knows that you're strongly authenticated. But the way that they get that is they actually have to go back to your attribute provider, your bank or your telco, to actually get that information. And when they do that, they get charged. So today, the healthcare institution, they are already incurring a cost to send a postcard to your house, and most people don't finish it. Here's an alternative where we tell them, okay, you can get the user's street address, but it ain't coming for free. You will have to pay for it. And if you're a website who, for example, cares about multi-factor authentication, you may need to pay for a confirmed assertion from an attribute provider that, hey, this person was more strongly authenticated than a password. So as another answer question, so there's potentially more money for websites who can both assert street address and strong authentication than an attribute provider who can only assert street address. Right? Julia?
I mean, this is great, and there's 2 issues, right? One
Only 2?
Well, one. The one that I see are that I only have one phone number, so as soon as I give it to one place, then I'm correlatable if I give it to somewhere else and they're sharing information.
Right. Well, realize they also want your street address.
Well, right, and I happen to live at Rocks 108 in the UPS store, so I don't worry about that so much. My bank thinks I live at the UPS store. So, I know, lots of people, I mean, really, it's nobody's business where I live. But this issue of the correlation of the phone numbers across contacts, like are mobile carriers going to start to issue me more than one phone number that works on the same phone so I can keep my personas separate?
Right.
Because I'm fine, if you link all my identity woman activity together, but no, my unconference business, like, that's a different phone number that shouldn't be almost together.
Yep. My expectation is if you went to one of these sites, they're probably just going to opt for the common user, and for the advanced user, they'll give you the option to have a postcard sent to your house like they do today. Realistically.
Right. So the whole system is based on like merging us all down to one.
It is based on correlating your offline and online identities even more than they are today.
So they can stalk us.
Yes, because we're all evil.
Okay.
Let's just assume that we're all evil, right? Assume that we are all evil. That's the quote of the day.
Eric Sachs.
Eric, I'm still not sure what you're trying to do here, right? Because an address, take Maryland, it had this big problem with falsified driver's licenses from immigrants.
Sure.
Right? Because a lot of states don't check what your immigration status is when you apply for a driver's license, and all they needed was, as Kalia said, was a post office box, and most all the immigrants went and got post office boxes, which was an address in Maryland. They submitted for their driver's license. They got a driver's license. Boom,
you're done.
And they're done. But
some of us consider that a feature.
So there is nothing. Actually, you're in worse shape in that situation because you're counting on these things to be somewhat verified, and according to yours, it would be verified, but they're really bogus.
Right. Well, and one of the things that a general reminder to keep aware of at least in the United States, most identity hijacking is still done by family members, mostly by family members in the same household. That doesn't go away. Like Cleveland Clinic's, old stat is about 8 to 10% of the requests for healthcare records where someone shows up in person with a government ID are false today, right? And that's accepted. So we're not making the claim that we would eliminate that. Not even making the claim it would necessarily significantly reduce it from what it is today, but we're taking a process that they already rely on. Again, these businesses, healthcare institutions, Social Security Administration, they're already doing the postal card trick. They already made that decision a while ago. What we're trying to do is to see if we can reduce some of the friction of that process. If we can at the same time as a community figure out even stronger ways to authenticate people, that would be more valuable. For example, there are some companies in this room who I would say do an even stronger job of verifying identity than a postcard to someone's house. They may well be may be able to charge relying parties more for those stronger assertions of identity than just a postal card trick.
So you said that now the identity system requires a sort of a micropayments infrastructure underneath it, which probably requires an identity infrastructure underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
Is it turtles all the way down?
Of course. I think at the lowest level, we start to rely, to be honest, at some level on certification and whitelist of certified parties in different areas. Certified IDPs, certified auditors of IDPs. So at the bottom of the turtles, it probably is going to be a small whitelist, right? DNS whitelist being maybe the smallest down at the bottom. So this slide is actually a bit out of date. This was a summary of just some initial market analysis we had done by March of this year, just to analyze where some of the initial interest might be in websites, specifically who were actually willing to pay for assertions about verified street address, or stronger things about strong authentication. And so you can just see some of the examples here, but starting with just funny enough, even the email providers and social networks themselves being interested because of the account hijacking costs that we deal with. But also, banks, healthcare, universities, TV Everywhere being a group who deals with content distribution. So that was sort of the initial group. There's been a bunch since then. So I listed before these sort of 3 known problems with our existing infrastructure of identity, that OpenID doesn't map to real world identity. Well, now here we have one way to do that, mapping their email address to a street address. The economic incentive, and again, we're going to demo this in a little bit more detail, but we've actually gone out and analyzed the market, asked them what their willingness is to pay for some of these things, and the amounts actually start to become interesting. I mean, if you can get, here's the example, if you can get 10 sites a year to pay $1 per user per year to verify their address, do that over 100 million people or so, you're talking big dollars here. So that's actually gotten interest from people. And as I say, the last portion is, the government could sort of supersede this and just say, oh, we want to be in that business, we want to take it over. But now there's, signed letter from President Obama, they're not going to. However, on the other hand, because they're not going to, and now, by the way, it goes to your turtles all the way down, one of the things they have said is they've said, well, maybe the government can actually help be one of the first relying parties in this space to say, well, look, the IRS and the VA and Social Security Administration, we trust these certified institutions, so therefore maybe other people should be willing to. So they feel like that's a role they could potentially play. So again, that's slides from back in March. What I'm actually going to show you all today is an early version of some demos of how this interaction model might actually work itself out. It's not a demo of everything, but it sort of gets the idea across. And there are 3 different components we're going to show, 3 different websites. One is a relying party. This is a website, like the IRS or bank or healthcare institution who needs your verified address and wants to log you in. So that's one website. The other website is a website who would actually be in the business of verifying your address. And as we've talked about, it could be a lot of things. It could be a mobile operator, bank, or specialist firm. And then the third example is just a user's identity provider. And we believe, based on a lot of usability experience of the community, that it is very hard to have users, say, go to the Social Security Administration and see a big long list of banks and specialized institutions and mobile operators and pick one of those to use to log in. I mean, who knows their login for bank off the top of their head? So we're sort of putting IDPs in the middle to improve the usability of the experience. But from a protocol level, and we'll talk about this in more detail, the identity provider, while they're sort of in the job of helping the information go between a relying party and identity provider, at least in the demos that we built, there's been no need for the identity provider to actually see a user's street address. So if you all want to try this yourself, by the way, there's a short link here, goog.gl Y9Y2C. Just don't try it now because there's not a lot of internet connectivity, so I want to make sure this works. So the first site over here is one where I've actually logged in and created an account. You'll notice that it's sort of labeled as Google being the identity provider, but right now it's just using a stubbed out account system. So if you went to it yourself to do a demo, you just make up your own account that you want to log in. So I'm logged in as, my name is Eric Summit and my email is ericsummit@gmail.com, but I have no verified addresses associated with my account. So this is sort of, emulating the identity provider side. Now I'm going to go over to this second website. This website is designed to be an attribute provider. And the attribute provider can run their login system any way they want. For example, if it's a bank or mobile operator, they probably already have one. Just to make this demo simpler for us to build, we just happen to configure that attribute provider to be a relying party to that the first demo app. So what actually happens here is I go to the attribute provider and I click a button, and what it does is it starts an OAuth flow with Google, and it says, hey, Google, I'm requesting from you the ability to know the user's email address and to have the ability to update their list of street addresses. So in quite possibly 2 to 3 weeks, this will actually be a standard plain vanilla Google OAuth page, just as we do for calendar, docs, anything like that. And a user would see that, hey, this third-party API wants to read their profile and manage their verified street addresses. So I'm going to say, yes, I as a user am okay with that happening. Now, I'll come back to this, attribute provider, and at least in this example, it hasn't yet verified any of my addresses. So I'm going to go in and just make one up right now. I'll call it my home, and let's see. City. Home in Redwood. So, 123 Main Street is the actual address. I've given a label that it is a home address and description home in Redwood. Obviously, I have some UI we can tweak up there. And I'm going to go ahead and add this. Now, in this particular example, this attribute provider, the way it verifies street addresses was theoretically by sending a postcard to your house. So for the demo, we could all sit in this room for 3 days, and I'll wait for a piece of mail to go there and come back. Or I can go and cheat. So if I just go down here and see my postcards, there's the postcard I would get with Bart Simpson's stamp. And I'll just copy that and go back. But the general idea that a user might receive this postcard in the mail, and it would tell them, okay, go back to this URL, enter that code, to verify this address.
Code needs to be 64-bit. Hopefully it needs to be short. That's one.
that looks awfully painful to have to type. But in any case, the user at this point has actually verified their address. But again, it is completely up to the attribute provider how to do this. If the attribute provider already has a pre-established business relationship with the user, then there's no need to go through this. That part has already been done. So I went and verified my address at the attribute provider. If I go back to my identity provider and do a refresh, you notice it now knows that, okay, I have authorized the street identity attribute provider to log me in and to have the ability to update my list of street addresses. And the attribute provider, as soon as it verified that address, it pushed up to Google, hey Google, I have an address for this user where the description is home in Redwood, and I'm the source. But it didn't actually push 123 Main Street up to the identity provider, just pushed a description and sort of a numeric identifier of the address. So now finally the sort of interesting stuff is what happens when a user goes to a relying party. Because theoretically all the other stuff we just showed is a one-time operation that a user performs. And again, if they pick attribute provider they already have an established relationship with, they don't even need to do the verification part. So imagine just going to the IRS and you want to see your tax records online. You would just choose your identity provider, and after you've done so, you'd be sent to your identity provider's standard consent page. The identity provider would say, hey, this website wants to read your profile information, log in, and it wants to read your list of street addresses. So the user gave the ability for the attribute provider to write them, and they're giving this relying party the ability to read them. And when the user says, yes, I consent to actually, having it evenly now she's gone. Okay, I can't make any jokes. So now the relying party is able to go ahead and make some API calls back to the identity provider and say, hey, identity provider, tell me the descriptive names of all the street addresses on file for this user. And it sees one called, home in Redwood. And it knows what particular attribute provider is valid for that. And this website says, oh, I trust that attribute provider, so great. Let me ask the user, is this the address where I should look up their IRS records or bank records? And the user says, yep, go ahead and please use it. as soon as the user says use it, the relying party actually makes an API call back to the attribute provider. And only at that time does the relying party get the user's actual now, 123 Main Street street address. Technically under the hood, what's happening is the relying party first made an API call to Google to get a list of addresses, and then it made an API call to Google and says, Google, I want to get the actual address for, what would I call it, home in Redwood City, or whatever was the descriptive name. What Google returns is a signed JWT token, as we've been talking about in some of these areas, just a signed blob from Google that has a bunch of information like the identity of the user, the mapped account at the attribute provider, the relying party, what it's for. The relying party gets this token, doesn't actually even bother looking at it, just takes the whole token, turns around, calls the attribute provider and says, here's a token that proves I should get access to some information. The attribute provider looks at it. They have to perform about 8 series of checks to make sure it's valid. And the assumption is, as part of those checks, the attribute provider would actually charge some micropayment to the relying party before it would return this information. But the end result is that the relying party is actually, just after 2 clicks here, able to see the user's email address, street address, and street address in a verified format that could allow it to actually unlock and show the user some information.
So there's one bit missing, which is the subsequent use of these attributes. How long the product can use that?
The relying party. So from Google's perspective, we're suggesting that the identity providers should stay out of some of those decisions, and that can be a relationship between the relying party and the attribute provider. I mean, assuming there's money going back and forth between them, we assume that the relying party and attribute provider have to have some legal agreement on usage of them. Like, one of the things that pretty much all the attribute providers have said is they're going to make sure legally a website who gets this attribute about a user cannot then turn around and sell it to another website. Right? They want to be the primary source. So they can also then choose to make some decisions about, time of this stuff. Now, turn around the other side, there are relying parties who have said, well, I only want information that's been verified within X period of time, months, years, etc. Common one right now seems to be verified once per year type of thing. And so they might consider some information to be stale, even though it's asserted. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Can I also set the permissions based on the attributes here?
Give me a specific example.
Let's say if I don't want to reveal the door number, I'm just saying, the set of attributes I provide, if I don't want to reveal certain information, you would buy that specific provider.
Right, and so that seems to be more of an area where the identity providers are likely to have the ability to compete with how much control they offer to users, reporting to users. And honestly, as hopefully most people in this room knows, giving those controls and balancing that with user experience are usually at opposite ends of the spectrum. So there's good opportunity there for identity providers to actually compete and go after different markets of user bases. Like, someone might try to make Kalia happy, could be a very hard job. But someone might even be successful. Others might go after a different segment of users. Similarly, different geographies. An identity provider may know that in Europe you have to treat information, for example, a little bit differently than you might have to in the US or Canada. But that's, again, one of the values of sort of splitting out the role of an attribute provider, maybe we should call it consent gatherer, and a relying party. Okay. So just to go back to, as I said, if you want to play around with this, there's a link here. It is our goal in Internet Workshop in a couple weeks to talk about this. Also, there's a planned conference in DC on November 9th and 10th, where a lot of the different companies who are interested in participating in this are meeting to go through this in more detail. If you go to the demos, there's actually also a document with pretty detailed user flows of how we envision this working, and even some rough descriptions of the API interaction. The demos themselves, right now, they're publicly available, and the source code for them, I think, may have already been posted in open source form. Dave, do you remember if we've done that yet or not? I think it was done this week. Because, again, this is one of the areas where we believe this is only going to work if there are a reasonably large set of attribute providers who can cover pretty much everybody, at least within a country, a reasonable number of identity providers who can similarly cover them, and a reasonable number of relying parties who are going to pay for this. This doesn't really make sense if there's only one relying party, one identity provider, and one attribute provider. So we're looking at actually building standards in this space that would attract other players in each of these different elements of the ecosystem. And this is sort of the more basic version. As someone was mentioning before, if this is at all successful, you're going to start to see other vendors playing other roles, like aggregating attributes, doing some of the payment collection and aggregation between relying parties and attribute providers. So those are other roles that we see are likely to come on board. With a little luck, the intern who's working on this area, Mache, will be back in time for the Internet Identity Workshop and can talk a little bit more in detail about the protocol aspects of this. But again, I think we had some interesting discussions yesterday where we saw a heck of a lot of overlap between UMA, JWT, OAuth2, and OpenID Connect in the different models that can be used here. And a lot of it just depends on the business use cases and how the money drives things. But anyways, that's it. Thank you for y'all's time.